Hello there, my name is Nemo, and a few months ago I created 3D Adventure, a GD level with a never-before-seen rendering technique. I can finally deflect the dim ripoff claims, because comparing these two is like comparing Wolfenstein to Doom. They only share the basic ideas.
Hey, I'm Nemo. I need to ask you a favor. When I originally released this level back in December, it did very poorly for 2 months of work. I completely gave up on recording this video, and I'm only making it now because a few people asked me directly for an explanation. Still, I'm a university student and I cannot keep doing this without your support. So, if you want to see more unhinged creations like this, please subscribe to the channel. With that said, let me show you how it's done.
The process starts with a player somewhere in the scene with a specific rotation. Let's say we already have a player controller, maybe I'll cover it in a separate tutorial. We then create the player's field of view, the width and depth of which can be varied. Its purpose is to tell us the distance from the player to a specific point of an obstacle in the scene. The distance is called the image depth. If we take depth of every point of the player's view and scale it in a certain way, we get what the player would see in a 3D scene. The scaling is exponential and can be derived from some scary looking trick. That is how 2D scenes can be converted to 3D, but in order to actually implement it we need a couple of extra steps. Let's start with rasterization. You can think of it as representing an analog image in discrete ways. The most common example is pixels on the screen. Individually, they are just lights of certain color, but the more of them you add together, the more it looks like a complete image. In this case, we can use the same idea to split our field of view into a number of separate rays, then split the resulting image into strips that each correspond to a ray, and thus we obtain a rough representation of the scene. Note that the more strips we add, the smoother the image looks. Now we need to put this concept to use in Geometry Dash. The task consists of two parts: getting the depth of the scene for a specific ray and scaling the corresponding strip. Let's start with the first one. We need to somehow measure the distance to the nearest wall in a given direction. That's where the new approach diverges from the dim rendering system. For the latter, the idea was simple. Let's take an already existing idea of splitting a value into discrete cases and divide the entire ray into different segments of depth. Add a collider to each and toggle the strip for corresponding height. This idea is pretty good, however, it is very heavy on triggers, groups and objects. Besides, same as before, the picture looks better the more divisions you add. However, every new division requires a lot of objects and an extra group. Given the game's 1000 group cap, this limitation remained a bottleneck for a while, and that was what forced me to come up with a new optimization. What if instead of dividing the ray into cases, we actually perform the ray cast? Let me explain. We can take an object at a camera position, then move it into the scene and stop it whenever it hits something. The time it takes is directly proportional to the distance to the wall, which is what we were looking for all this time. In GD, we need collision blocks to detect intersections, so that's what we should use as the object. The catch is that the game's collision detection is, suboptimal, so if the collider moves too fast, the precision becomes too low, but slowing it down increases the time per cast. The solution is to cast multiple rays in a single direction simultaneously. I found that 3 casts, each taking 0.3 seconds, produces a smooth picture in 10 frames per second. Of course, dim technique did not have an FPS cap, but remember that it's Geometry Dash level we're talking about. The performance difference is really not that noticeable when your 3D looks like this. And in exchange for lower frames, you get unrestricted strip height instead of these steps, as well as the ability to add textures to your walls, something the dim engine couldn't do without duplicating the existing rendering system, doubling its group count in the hundreds. Anyway, now that we know how to get the depth of the scene, we need to change the height of the corresponding strip. The problem of course is that the game does not have a scale trigger as of yet, so changing the height of an object isn't quite as simple. The way to do it is by splitting the strip into a number of segments, then hiding them behind one another and moving each up and down to create the illusion of scaling. With a little bit of careful positioning and Z-layer arrangement, you can even add a bit of texture. Also, Geometry Dash has the follow trigger that allows an object to copy the movement of the target with a certain coefficient. By making each segment of the strip follow an indicator, we can control the height of the strip with a single object. Another small issue is the conversion of depth data to strip height. The best way to do it is by adding an object that mimics the movement of the ray with an exponential factor to account for the juicy trig. Essentially, its Y position corresponds to the time the ray took to travel to a wall, and the distance to that wall. Then, when we know that the ray has hit something, we can move the wall height indicator to the position of the intermediate object. That gives us a strip scaled to the right height, and when we add dozens of those strips together, we'll get something that looks like an actual 3D image. Finally, let's discuss possibly the most important feature of this renderer: coloring the walls. Since one collider corresponds to one strip, we can add additional wall blocks with different collision IDs that will change the colors for a specific strip. The beauty of this method is that, using pulse to color, we can set the colors of the strips to a destination color. Then, if we change the latter, we change all of the strips' colors with a single trigger. With that, the renderer is complete. I should also briefly mention the entity rendering method, which is a maze of its own. I used a couple of continuous scaling techniques used with the walls to determine the screen position and size of the item. Then I used similar scaling methods of hiding objects behind each other. Finally, because all of that takes a lot of groups, I only used a single entity that I recolored to make it appear as different keys and coins. At last, the 3D part of the project is complete. From there on, little was left, just building the level itself, creating maps, color schemes, transitions, and text. And here's the result. It took me a few minutes to describe what I did, but it took me around 50 days to actually do it. A large problem when doing massive projects like this one is that at a certain point the amount of triggers becomes too big to place by hand. 3D Adventure has literally thousands of triggers, and all of them went through hundreds and hundreds of iterations before I finally found the look that I was satisfied with. So I had to unleash my rudimentary Python skills, and utilize this obscure library called gd.py to automate the process. By the end, I accumulated hundreds of lines of spaghetti code that were a project of their own. I am a no-life programmer, so I didn't really mind, but I understand that there might be some unfortunate souls here who have at some point in their lives actually touched grass. That's why I am announcing a 3D level development tool that will allow you to make a configurable 3D level of your own without the tedium of recreating the rendering engine from scratch.
However, there's a catch. See, as I mentioned, I'm a university student, and I do not have time to do this. So, to give myself a long enough development period, I will only release this tool when I hit 1,000 subscribers. So, if you're interested, spam your family, friends, and your employer with a link to this video. I need all of those subscribers. Oh, and yeah, thanks for watching, and see you later.